type of enthusiasm was generated by 9.9? Two, Accabre in 1763. And can you explain a little bit on the rift between the West Africans and the...
Accabre is himself, Accabre, persons with Musari who betrayed it? Or you talking about Accabre?
Accabre. There are two Accabre. Well, I think they are...
You mean?
Of Accabre College, failed.
No, I can't answer that at all. Studied him, and to me he was a minor revolutionary. The other Accabre gave up, joined forces with the revolutionaries towards that, so I can't think. Yes, go ahead.
The rift between the West Africans and the Congos or Angolans, and of course, as I said in the beginning, what type of excitement was generated by 9.9?
Are you talking about athletics?
Let me ask a supplementary question. Who is the Accabre of Martin Luther Square?
I don't know which Accabre you wrote about, but I suspect that this was the one who betrayed the revolt. It was a poem about negativity, right? The Accabre who is more celebrated and well known, and for whom we focus most attention, is the one who joined with Kusari to be, in the last days, to join with the counter-revolutionaries to find out the Maroon communities. He got a ransom for his life, he was taken to Europe, and he joined the colonial forces later. That is the Accabre most persons tend to focus on. The other one is hardly is mentioned just in passing, that's why I asked him. And he is only really in the history books because of his counter-revolutionary stance. But I don't know if everybody can answer that question about Accabre.
Two questions. Based on your research, what coming out in terms of analysis role the Christian missionary played? And two, generally when we, meaning Afro-Guyanese, talk about slavery and in essence trying to educate young Africans also of the subject, they generally get the reply, why talk about those black stuff, why go back there, it brings back anger and things to show. And in essence, it's not good for development and so on. Could you share a comment for young African?
Christian missionaries not during the Berbice Revolt. You mean
general.
Because they were not Christian missionaries during the revolt at that time at all. And the only Christian person who is mentioned there as preacher is Reverend Ramring, R-M-R-N, whom the insurgents treated very respectfully and even allowed him to go free. They seem to have had a very positive attitude towards him, but we don't know anything else. They did not have missionaries. The missionaries you would have had to speak of would be the London Missionary Society's missionaries in the early 19th century. I don't know if those are the two, John Ray and John Smith, principally.
Yeah, but basically that was my question.
Okay.
What role they played for the African community during the time of slavery in your analysis based on your research?
Right. Well, one can say very clearly, the missionaries of the London Missionary Society made a very positive impact on the lives and the psyche of the black enslaved and free, because they came out with specific ideas to convert them, not necessarily to free them, but once they got into the colonies and they saw the lifestyle and what was happening, and also all the restrictions that were being placed on the proselytization and getting the enslaved people to church, they became more strongly anti-slavery and wrote up a lot of negative things against the plantation owners. And one of these persons I mentioned in my talk with the lady who was given 150 lashes for insolence. The case only came to light because Reverend John Ray wrote to his superiors in London and mentioned it, and they took it up with the colonial government. And the colonial government wrote back saying, has this been dealt with? John Ray, you know John Smith, of course, he was forced to flee, not flee the country. He was locked up. He died in prison before the reprieve. John Ray in Berbice was a counterpart, although there was no uprising in 1823 there. John Ray's church was burned down in Berbice, and he was threatened, and for the next few years it was very difficult. We know also that in the case of the Caribbean as a whole, the Anglicans brought in their first bishops into the region in 1824 to counter the influence of the missionaries. And they created the first bishopric, as I said, in that year, and also in Guyana. It was the Anglican Church began to proselytize because they were afraid of allowing the missionaries to do so. So in the last phase of slavery, the missionary element is very strongly on the side of the enslaved people. This is not to give them equality, not to give them estates, but to give them freedom, to allow them to work. They believed that blacks could not really fill the pulpits in meaningful ways. And for another century or so, the churches did not have as their head or even their main, some of the multitude black person, but rather whites and then colors. But on the issue of slavery, they were largely anti-slavery. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Greetings. My name is Ras Leon. You're right. And earlier when some people came, they saw Uprising. I wrote it.
Okay.
And I produced it now. In case you want to see more of it, I've got more copies. But my question is, it has been said that Kofi committed suicide. I'm wondering that for a man who is supposed to have been an akomfo, a high priest, a spiritual man, to what extent a man of that kind of state of mind would want to be in the frame of mind to commit suicide at the end of a process of liberation, or what he had begun as a process of liberation. So I question that aspect of the history, and I don't know if there's empirical evidence to bear out the fact that Kofi did commit suicide. More than that, there's also the relationship of the slaves who had run away from or had moved across land to Suriname, for example, who had become truckers. And the whole question of descendancy. If it is that Kofi had indeed committed suicide, it meant that Kofi might not have had any descendants. But within a spiritual frame, I tend to feel within myself that Kofi might have not committed suicide, could have gone up into the highlands and become a maroon, could have gone across land, gone across the Suriname and become more than that. The point I'm trying to make is that in this time, 250 years later, what is that spiritual energy that keeps us going on so that we know that the revolution is still alive? Because a lot of people feel that it happened then and it's over. And I'm saying that the revolution is still alive. Simply, the architecture might have changed, our costumes might have changed, the technology might have changed, but the conditions that existed then still exist now in a very insidious manner. And we might be fooled and lulled into a state of complacency, feeling that Master Day is over, when Marcel might have just assumed a different skin color or a different philosophy in terms of his oppression. So, do you think that the descendants of Kofi in this time can still rise up and complete the process that was begun 250 years ago? Thank you.
You asked several questions. Now, dealing with the issue of Kofi's suicide. For me, the problem in history at the time is not the suicide itself, but the burying of the arms and possibly the gunpowder, which might suggest a degree of selfishness, although it is counteracted by what I have said, that the legend that has come to us asserts that his followers, erstwhile followers, including Atta, gave him a chief's burial. We could only be worried. I mean, I believe any suicide is an unwanted loss. But the committing of suicide was an act of bravery among Africans. There are several examples of this outside of the slavery context. Is there also in the Roman Empire? Is there among the Japanese? The act of suicide was very common. And in fact, it was even so common among ordinary enslaved people that whites used to cut off the heads and limbs of enslaved people to show the same to their brethren and say, because they believed they will go back to Africa, that these blacks will go back to Africa without arms and legs and so forth. They used to you can find it trout, you can find it in the Danish West Indies. So you cannot argue logically from the records that slavery was an act of suicide for enslaved people. And also, the evidence for him committing suicide is alleged to have come from the evidence that was actually given at the trial of some of the enslaved people after the revolution was put down. The evidence about burying the gunpowder is more woolly, but it is doubtful that one could really overturn the view that he committed suicide in his own terms as an act of bravery, rather than being caught. Yes.
Yes. Good evening. The other lecturer was here, and it's in the same vein of what we're discussing now about the suicide aspect. That is of physical death in the battle against this evil. But I must mention that there are Ethiopian, at least I know of one Ethiopian king who did committed suicide when he was about to be captured. I think that was Johannes. And the question I was going to ask the last time, I was the next person in line, but everything finished at that time after 3 questionnaires. The question was, because he had made a statement that about the Caribbean leaders meeting, and he hoped that they paying attention. Even one gentleman had asked, tell him that if you introduce your book to them, right, which is a comprehensive understanding of the problem, right? And the brother would say, you need to give this book to them, these Caribbean leaders who's supposed to be representing African people. And the question I wanted to ask, which is also in that vein, was that, are there any military people representing African people? Because in these times, there aren't any military people. We have academics, right? Some of them are militant. So it's not because they're academics and they're not a soldier, I mean they're not, in the vein. So that's the question I wanted to ask. Are there any military people representing us? Which comes to the fact of people losing their lives, because we see to have a lot of cowards today who are not willing to represent African people in any form of physical danger. So that's the question I want to ask. Because we talk about coffee and these persons fighting a revolution, which is physical danger. I just don't want you to make a comment on that.
Right. The answer is, I don't know of any. And the second answer is, I don't see the necessity for it. Because my whole lecture is predicated on the view that certainly for Guyana, we are a people and must remain as a people. And let me tell you something. Why I am where I am today, and I come to tell you every ethnic group, I cannot relate. You may disagree with me and say whatever you want. When I was around the age of 12, I was one out of 5 persons who won a scholarship. In those days, if you did not win a scholarship, you had to pay for your secondary education, or in my day, I was likely to be recruited by my father, as my brother who is in this audience this evening was, to become a blacksmith. Though he lifted, I'm digressing, though he lifted himself up by his own bootstrap to get 5 O levels and 3 A levels, to end up as a deputy commissioner of this country and commissioner of police and commissioner of police in St. Kitts. I speak of no other than Thompson. But for me, I won a scholarship to the Indian Education Trust, which had less than 2% black persons, and received my first 4 years of education. Had Indians as my friends. I said to my wife, who knows, I might have married an Indian, but I was too young. So I can understand for Guyana all this ethnic conflict. It was new to me. I had to reorganize my life. And when the fighting took place in the early 60s, I was studying in Jamaica. For me, it is therefore not about military stance, not about any such thing. It is Guyanese people coming together. If you want to go out in South Africa or some other part of the world, and so take that. But I am not prepared to work in an environment in Guyana where there is ethnic strife and conflict. That is for me. I'm telling you, you may say I'm a coward. I left Guyana because I could not take it anymore. When a job was offered to me, I was working at the University of Guyana. And when the ethnic conflicts began and the struggle, and people dipping into people's lives at the university because they had to toe certain lines, I said I worked too hard for my education. The job was offered to me. I spent about 5 years in Barbados, 5 years in Ghana, and then returned home. Ghana had their trouble in ethnic conflict. I remained in Barbados. But I never gave up my consideration for Guyana. As I said, I've written a lot about Guyana.
And the question I want to ask is...
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic. The question I want to ask is, why is this not of the whites against the black? And I think the reason can be traced back to a book written by the Prince, in which he stated quite clearly, it is better to be feared than to be loved. And I wonder what role he played in this violence that perpetrated.
Yeah, are you speaking in the Caribbean slavery context or generally? No, but you see, when we trace back in history, though unlike what some people say, there was prejudice against blacks. And in some instances, blacks had prejudices against whites. It was never institutionalized. So you can find whole societies with black people interacting with whites and vice versa. But where, at a point in time, that's a long lecture in itself, black people, because of their proximity, cheapness, etc., were made to be enslaved. Color itself came to distinguish people first and foremost, easily identifiable, and the whites who were indentured servants were lifted up. Because Hilary Beckles, he spoke last week, and he has a book entitled Black Slaves and White Servants or something, and in Barbados in the latest 17th century, and it shows in many instances as black against blacks, and even revolted together. And among Maroons in various parts of the New World, white persons revolted too, especially military personnel. So it is a function of the slavery regime and the control to keep a people of a certain color easily identifiable and so that you get that, and then it became a widespread issue. So race prejudice, but racial discrimination only developed institutionally under the slavery regime. Yes, one last.
My name is Grace Cyfox. I would on your first comment, your recent comment about ethnicity. At this point in time, I'd like to honor our Chetty Jagan and Mr. Burnham in selecting the 1763 monument as our national monument. I say this because they give it some thought before deciding on making this so. Covey had to deal with African people from different countries. They came from different countries. They saw now, present day, that we have different ethnic groups. The point here is that there must be unity in order to achieve. Juxtaposing that against what's going on today, they say that we will have to look at what happened there to learn from that now, present day Guyana. We have to put away our differences, whether we are black, whether we're Indian, Portuguese, or whatever, if we need this country to go forward. We have to take care of every child, every person, regardless of color. If we have to fight against the world, what's happening now, the other countries want to come and fleece Guyana, we all have to stand as one. We lost our gold, we lost our diamonds, we lost everything. We were fleeced. We were not looking at that. We have to get together as a nation, put away our color. If they in 1763 had put away their differences and stood as one, that revolution would have been successful.